The most dangerous, emotionally unavailable people are not the coldest ones. They're the ones who know how to create closeness, just not how to sustain it. They open up enough to disarm you. They become soft at exactly the moments you're about to detach. They let you see their wounds, their fears, their tenderness, their exhaustion, their inner child, their loneliness. And because you can access those layers, you assume intimacy is growing. But emotional exposure is not the same thing as emotional availability. That distinction changes everything. A lot of people get trapped because they confuse glimpses with capacity. They think, if they can be this loving sometimes, then this must be who they really are. So when the distance returns, they don't question the pattern. They wait for the good version to come back. And that waiting can quietly restructure your entire emotional reality. You start planning your reactions more carefully. You become hyper-aware of timing, tone, pressure, wording. You learn when to be soft, when to back off, when not to ask too much, when to make yourself smaller so they don't disappear. And slowly, without announcing itself, the relationship becomes organized around their fragility instead of your mutual security. That's not intimacy. That's emotional accommodation. And emotional accommodation is exhausting because it keeps you in a permanent state of self-monitoring. This often shows up in anxious-avoidant dynamics. The anxious person experiences distance as a threat and moves closer for reassurance. The avoidant person experiences emotional demand as pressure and moves away for space. One pursues, one withdraws, then eventually the withdrawer re-enters with warmth, vulnerability, or affection. The closeness feels beautiful because it comes after deprivation. But because the underlying pattern hasn't changed, the cycle restarts. That's why you can feel deeply bonded to someone who still doesn't know how to hold you consistently. The chemistry is real, the impact is real, the memories are real. But the stability is still missing. And instability has a way of making love feel deeper than it is. Not because it is deep, but because your body has to work so hard to keep up with it. The more emotionally expensive the connection becomes, the more significant it can seem. You think, surely this means something if it affects me this much. But intensity is not proof of compatibility. Sometimes it's proof that your attachment system is activated. This is where attachment styles become powerful to understand. If you lean anxious, you may interpret inconsistency as a challenge to solve. You seek reassurance, clarity, contact, and emotional confirmation. When someone pulls away, your focus sharpens. You want repair. You want reconnection. You want to feel safe again. If they lean avoidant, they may genuinely feel overwhelmed by closeness, even while wanting it. They may crave intimacy, then retreat when it becomes too real. They may miss you intensely in your absence, then shut down in your presence if the emotional stakes start rising. So the relationship keeps moving between access and retreat, and in the middle of that cycle, you can end up blaming yourself for a pattern you did not create. You start wondering if you were too emotional, too available, too intense, too demanding, too sensitive, too honest, too much. But most of the time, what triggered the instability was not your neediness. It was the fact that real closeness requires consistency, and consistency is exactly what emotionally unavailable people struggle to provide. Now here's where it gets darker. Some emotionally unavailable people are not simply confused. Some have learned how to use selective vulnerability as a form of control. They tell you just enough truth to earn your empathy, but not enough truth to create accountability. They explain their wounds in detail, but never use that insight to change their behavior. They make you understand them so deeply that you start abandoning your own standards in the name of compassion. That's how self-betrayal begins to feel noble. You think you're being patient. You think you're being mature. You think you're loving them in the way they've never been loved before. But if all that grace keeps flowing one direction, it stops being love and starts becoming emotional self-neglect. Healthy relationships do make space for fear, trauma, imperfection, and healing. But healthy relationships do not make one person carry the emotional weight of both people. They do not require endless understanding without structural change. They do not demand that you keep proving your softness while the other person keeps postponing responsibility. And that postponement has consequences. Because after enough cycles, your self-trust starts breaking down. You stop knowing whether your expectations are valid. You stop knowing whether you're reading things correctly. You stop knowing whether you're patient or just attached. The relationship becomes mentally loud. Even when nothing is happening, it occupies space in your body. That is not peace. That is not safety. And no matter how intense the bond feels, intensity without safety will eventually drain your identity. Maybe you've lived this already. Maybe they were incredible after conflict, tender after distance, deep late at night, honest only when you were halfway out the door. Maybe every time you accepted the reality of who they were, they showed you just enough tenderness to reopen the case. Maybe they never fully lied, but they also never gave you a stable truth you could build a life on. That kind of person can leave a deep mark because they create emotional memories without emotional consistency, and the mind keeps trying to return to the peak moments as proof that the relationship was real. But a relationship is not measured by its peak moments. It is measured by its repeated reality. Repeated reality tells the truth. Did you feel secure? Did you feel respected? Did you feel chosen in action, not just in mood? Did their self-awareness create change or just better excuses? Did their vulnerability lead to accountability, or did it only deepen your attachment? Those questions matter more than whether they meant it in the moment. The power shift begins when you stop idealizing their capacity based on flashes. Stop building your future around their rarest version. Stop treating potential as evidence. Stop making a home inside someone's temporary tenderness. Because temporary tenderness can feel sacred when you've been living in emotional drought. But if it disappears every time real consistency is required, then what you experienced was not stable love. It was access. And access is not commitment. You are allowed to care about someone and still admit they are unsafe for your heart. You are allowed to understand their wounds and still refuse the consequences of them. You are allowed to feel the bond and still leave the pattern. That is maturity. That is discernment. That is self-respect without emotional numbness. So, if you've been waiting for the loving version of them to come back permanently, hear this clearly. The rare version is not the real version. The repeated version is. And once you accept that, you stop grieving fantasy as if it were fate. You stop negotiating with inconsistency. You stop calling emotional instability a deep connection. And finally, you become available for something that doesn't require you to disappear in order to keep it.